Okay, so I welcome you to Mindful Awakening, and this is going to be a three-part series on working with the mind, on mindfulness of the mind. And this is a foundational series of techniques that I learned early on in my practice. And really, it was the beginning of a massive shift in the way that I experienced myself, in the way I experienced the world, in the way I experienced experience. Things really, really changed as a result of bringing mindfulness to the activity of thinking. I really thought that to be a good meditator, one had to shut off thoughts, that was the way to be good at it. And I had a lot of pretty nasty, negative, dark, suffering filled thoughts. And so the idea of being able to turn my thoughts off actually seemed pretty awesome. But this fantasy of being able to have a perfectly quiet mind the first time I sat down to meditate kept me from sitting down to meditate, because I would sit down and I would try to focus on something like my breath or a mantra, and I would keep getting pulled back into my thoughts again and again and again and again. And it made me feel like a failure, like, I can't do this. I'm not able to meditate. I'm never going to have a peaceful mind. I'm always going to be suffering in this way, and meditation doesn't work for me. And I have a lot of people that I've met over the years that have had a similar relationship to meditation. I've heard so many people say, I'm just not good at it. My mind is too busy. My mind is too full. So I was really grateful when I was taught to actually meditate on my thoughts, rather than have the thoughts be this obstacle to get around or this issue to get rid of. When I learned that I could use my thoughts as the object of focus, that really, really changed my relationship to meditation. And it was the beginning of a huge paradigm shift. So I want to start with the basic foundational practice that I started with. And then we'll go through in the next two sessions and explore different ways of working with the mind. But the first one is simply to observe, to witness the activity of thinking. And our thinking comes in one of two ways. It's either arising as mental talk, so the voice in your mind, and you can even try it out right now. I'll stop speaking for 30 seconds and just notice if there's any mental talk that arises in your mind. Okay. Did you notice any sounds in the mind? Any words? Maybe something saying, um, oh, am I doing this right? Where's the thinking? I'm not sure if I'm thinking. Or maybe some replay of a conversation you had earlier today, or maybe some sort of judgmental thought, or maybe just some random narrative going on in the mind. So that would be auditory thinking, that would be mental talk. So that's one way that our thinking might arise. Another way is through visual thinking. So through images in the mind. These could be images, again, sort of like images of something that happened earlier today. These could be daydream type imagery. These could be images of your body or the space around you. So we can just try that for 30 seconds. Let's just see what happens if you close your eyes, because it's going to be much easier when you're first beginning this technique to have the eyes closed while you do it. So closing your eyes and bringing your attention to any mental images that arise. Now, you don't need to create them. Just notice if they arise. If no images arise, that's just fine. Not everybody experiences that. Okay, good. Did you notice any sort of images arising? Some of you may have noticed, some of you may not have noticed. It's not a problem if you didn't notice any. So for most folks, mental talk is happening somewhere here, towards the back of the head, between the ears. And for most folks, mental image is happening somewhere up here, around the eyes. That's not necessarily the case for everyone. That's just for most people. Generally, that's where it's happening. So if you take a moment and you consider, where did I notice the mental talk? Where did I notice the mental image? Where was that happening? That's the beginning of getting mindful, learning to witness, to observe the activity of your mind. Just be aware, where is it actually happening? So that's part of what we'll explore. We'll explore, where is the mental talk arising? Where are the mental images arising? Another thing we might notice is the pitch or the pace or the volume of the mental talk. The texture of the talk. With images, we might be noticing the colors, the saturation. Might be noticing the way the images bubble up and then vanish, the way they expand and contract. Might be noticing how much of the visual field the image is taking up. So we get very curious here about the activity. So you'll notice I'm not talking about the content. For this practice, we're not really concerned with what the thoughts are. It doesn't matter if they're negative thoughts. It doesn't matter if they're positive thoughts. It doesn't matter if they're profound, like our extreme genius pouring through, or if they are just boring, random, mundane thoughts. It just doesn't matter with this practice. We're not concerned with the content. Now, you may be fully aware of the content. You may know the thought you're thinking. You may even have some sort of psychological, analyzation of it going. But what I want you to notice is both the thought and the analyzation of that thought are made up of thought. And that's what we're interested in. We are interested in the activity of the thinking. So we're stepping back from our personal experience with the thoughts. And we're actually getting curious about what makes up this thinking. What are the elements of this activity? Now, as we're working with observing, witnessing the activity of the mind, it can be really helpful to use labels. So I'm going to offer you that option. The labels are an option, they're optional, but you might want to use some labels to help facilitate mindfulness, to help you to stay aware of what it is that you're focusing on. The labels are not there to, again, get rid of the thinking, and they're not a mantra. They're really just literally labeling what you're paying attention to. And so as we move into the practice, you'll have the option to use labels, and we'll use the label talk and the label image. So talk will be for any auditory thinking, and image will be for any visual thinking. I originally learned this technique from my dear friend Michael Taft, and he had been and continues to be a student of Shinzen Young. So eventually, not long after, I started working with Shinzen as well, and he doesn't use these particular labels anymore, but the techniques come from my study with him. So again, the labels are going to be optional. You can use the label talk to acknowledge mental, auditory mental activity, and the word image to acknowledge visual mental activity. So it would be something like this. You'd be paying attention to what's happening in your mind, and you might say, talk, talk, image, image, talk. So you'll notice the labels are neutral, they're gentle, they're even. It's like every 3 or 4 seconds, maybe 5 seconds. And you can say them out loud, certainly, but you can also just say them silently in your mind. The thing with labels when working with mental activity is that the labels are mental activity. So it can get a little bit convoluted in there. So if the labels seem to just make it more complicated, less possible to be mindful, then drop them. They're just there as a support if needed, if wanted. Again, they're neutral, they're even. They're really just there to facilitate mindfulness with what it is that we're paying attention to. And what we're paying attention to is the activity of the mind. So again, you don't need to turn it off and you don't need to change it. This is not an intentional thinking practice. So if you just sit there and the whole time you're just worrying about money, for example, that's fine as long as you are aware of the activity that's making up those thoughts. You could be sitting there thinking, I'm the most amazing person on earth and I love myself so much and I'm filled with creativity and love. Doesn't matter if that's what the thoughts are, because we're not really interested in the content, we're interested in the activity of the content. So I use those as examples, right? You could be worrying, you could be having negative thoughts, or you could be having these like really self-loving thoughts. For this practice, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. It's all about noticing the actual activity, the arising and passing of thought. So if you're sitting, meditating, and you're observing thinking, and the thinking starts saying, I'm not doing this right, or I'm no good at meditation, what do you do? Well, you start noticing those thoughts as the activity of thinking. Doesn't matter if you're good at meditation or not. That's not the point of the practice. The point of the practice is to observe the thinking that's happening. And you will inevitably get pulled into the thoughts. You will go unconscious in the thoughts. It's what we do. And so when you find that you've been pulled off into some, thread of thinking, and you're no longer consciously observing the activity, you're just going to gently bring yourself back, with kindness, with celebration. Oh, I noticed that I was lost in my thought. I woke up and I came back. That's awesome. Now I'm going to go back to observing, to witnessing the process. So while we're paying attention, how are we going to pay attention? We're going to pay attention by bringing our awareness, our attention to the arising and passing as it's happening. So like I said, for most people, mental talk's happening back here, mental images happening here. It might be somewhere else for you. We're going to actually put our attention there. Just like you might put your attention on your breath or a mantra or a candle flame, you're going to put your attention on the area where the mental talk or the mental image is arising. And that's what you keep coming back to. If there is mental talk arising, you're observing it. If there is mental image arising, you're observing it, you're witnessing it. If there's not, if there's none, then you're just noticing that open, empty, quiet space. And eventually some thoughts will arise. Like the thought, my mind is so quiet, right? That will then be the thought that's arising, that your mind is so quiet. So there'll usually be at least some thinking during the practice. Most likely a lot of thinking. And that's great because that's lots and lots of material for you to practice with. But again, if there is no mental talk or mental image arising, then just be with that open, quiet space. All right, so let's give it a try. Go ahead and get settled into a posture that works for you. So I'm in a chair with a cushion behind my back, supporting my back. You may choose to position yourself in another way. You might sit on the floor. You might use a meditation cushion or a meditation bench. You might lie down, or you might even stand up. Finding a position that works for you. Now, you could also do this in movement. You could be doing this practice walking. That can be a little more challenging when you're first beginning, but if this is something that you're practiced at, if you do a lot of meditation, then by all means, make it a walking meditation. So finding whatever posture is going to work for you for today. Remembering it's always okay to move if you need to. You don't have to be perfectly still, but stillness can be really supportive. Can be really supportive to the practice. So perhaps you're intending on stillness, but doing what you need to do for your body. Before we go into the practice of working with the mind, I want to offer one thing that is kind of going to be like our home base, and that is resource. And resource is a place in your body or your mind or externally that feels good or neutral, safe or grounded, a place that you can go if you ever feel overwhelmed. And when we're working with the mind, sometimes there can be overwhelm because the mind can be a dark place for some of us. When we sit and we focus on it, a lot can come up. And sometimes we can sit with it and just observe it. And that's part of what this practice will do. It helps you to deconstruct and to witness without getting pulled into the content. But if you find that you're getting pulled into the content and you're feeling overwhelmed, going to resource is a really great option. And so we'll start there and then we'll go into the technique. So eyes can be opened or closed, whatever feels best for you. And I want to invite you to scan your body using your physical awareness and find a spot that feels best. It can be a spot that feels grounded, peaceful, neutral, even pleasurable. Maybe your feet or your hands or the heaviness of your butt and your legs as you sit. If you can find a spot like that in your body, then that's where I'd like you to start focusing your attention on this resource in your body. If for any reason a resource in the body is not available, then try opening your eyes and making contact with an object that is neutral or pleasant to look at, or a sound. And finally, if that's not an option, then create a resource in your mind by thinking a positive thought, bringing up a positive image or positive words. So I'm giving you options, but the first choice and what I'd like you to use if it's available is a resource in your body, a place in your body that feels anywhere from neutral to pleasurable. And we're just going to focus here for a moment. Okay, good. Now, this is something you can always come back to anytime in the practice or anytime in your life. You can come back to resource. So it's there for you. It's an option always. Now we'll begin to move into the focus on mind practice. We're going to begin with observing mental talk. Most people experience that. Most people I've ever come in contact with experience that. So it's a great place to begin. But remember, if you're not experiencing mental talk, just enjoy that quiet, peaceful space. So eyes closed can be helpful in the beginning, but please feel free to practice however you wish. Bring your attention to the area where mental talk arises for you. And if you're not sure where that is, just hang out and eventually some will arise. And that's where I'd like you to place your attention. We're going to witness the activity of mental talk. If you'd like, you can use the label talk to acknowledge the activity. You don't need to label every thought, just use the label every 3 to 5 seconds to acknowledge that it's happening. Remembering that the label itself is mental talk, so no need to label the label. And we're just going to rest our attention here, witnessing the activity of mental talk. You might be hearing full sentences as if you're listening to someone else speak, or you might just be catching the tail end of a thought here or there. Either of those, anything in between is fine. Just keep coming back to witnessing, to observing in a curious and accepting way the activity of mental talk. using the label talk if that's helpful for you. Anytime you find yourself pulled into the thinking, taking the thinking personally, getting involved in the content, going unconscious in the thoughts, come back to witnessing. Come back to observing the activity. But no need to judge that. You can celebrate the moment of awakening, the moment that you realize you were pulled into thought. And in that celebratory space, come back to witnessing. And you might notice some mental talk about the fact that you got pulled off. That's what you'll now witness. No matter what mental talk is arising, that is the object of focus. That is what we're meditating on. We're noticing the tones, the textures, the volume, the pitch, the pace of the mental talk. If you know what the content is, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine. The point here is that we are witnessing in this curious and accepting way the activity of mental talk. Noticing that mental talk arise and pass. Witnessing the activity. Okay, now you can absolutely stay with this, continuing to witness, to observe, to become mindful of mental talk. Or if you like, you can switch now to mental image. So for some of you, you've been noticing mental image arise. You've been seeing pictures that go along with the words, or maybe you've been seeing pictures rather than words. And so we'll shift now to noticing mental image. As I said before, for most folks, mental image is happening around the eyes, but it could be somewhere else for you. So take a moment And perhaps start by putting the attention around the space in front of the eyes and just noticing, is there anything arising here? Or maybe you're already aware of where mental image arises for you because it was arising earlier as we were paying attention to mental talk. So that's where I want you to put your attention, wherever those images were popping up. Now, if there are no images, you can either gaze into the blank, empty space where you imagine image might be if it were present, or you can keep focusing on mental talk. So choose one or the other. What we're doing here is we're separating out the strands of mental talk and mental image so that they're two separate experiences. This process helps us to get a different kind of perspective on the mind. This deconstruction of mental talk from mental image allows us to start to see the mind as something other than what we are. We start to get some space. We start to be able to witness rather than be our thoughts. So shifting into mental image, and if you like, using the label image to acknowledge any images that are arising. And again, you don't need to label every single image. You can use the label every 3 to 5 seconds. And the label is optional, so use it if it's supportive. Keeping the eyes relaxed as you gaze at image. Remembering it doesn't matter what the images are of, it's about the activity. It's the movement of the images, it's the color, the shadows, the dark, the light, the area that they're arising from and passing into. The activity. If you find that you get pulled into the image, into the visual story, step back, so to speak, and witness, observe the activity rather than getting lost in it, but always celebrating those moments of realizing you've been lost. If you find that your mental talk and mental image are getting tangled up, untangle and just bring your attention to mental image, unless you're choosing to focus on mental talk. So either one is okay, but know what you're focusing on and focus there. Again, if you get pulled in unconsciously to imagery, come back to witnessing, to observing, in a curious and accepting way, perhaps using the label image to help facilitate mindfulness of this visual activity of the mind. Okay, now we can open up to both. So you can free float between mental image and mental talk, allowing your attention to land on either one and then acknowledging that that's what you're noticing. You're noticing either mental talk or mental image. So we're still working to separate these strands, but we're opening up to both strands. You might find that you land more on mental talk or more on mental image, or you might find that you kind of float back and forth. If you are floating back and forth and you're using that label system, then it might sound something like this: image, image, talk, image, image. You may notice as you practice that there are periods where there is no talk or image. So just feel free to be in that open space. And when some images or mental talk arises, come back to witnessing, using the labels if it's supportive or dropping them if it's not. We'll spend another moment with this, remembering that if you find you're pulled into your thinking, then you're a human being. It's normal. Rather than using this as an opportunity to build up a negative connotation related to your meditation practice, instead, celebrate the moments when you recognize that you've been unconscious, that you've been lost in their thoughts. And in that celebratory space, come back to witnessing, to observing, to becoming mindful of the activity of your mind. At this time, you can either be free floating between mental talk and mental image, or perhaps you want to just work with one. focusing only on mental talk or only on mental image. This is your practice. Do what feels in alignment for you. Remembering that you can always return to resource if you're ever feeling overwhelmed in any way. Okay, so now let's all go to resource. So even if you're having a grand time with us, I hope you are, let's all go to resource. So that can be a place in your body that feels neutral or all the way up to pleasurable, or it can be something external that's neutral or pleasant, or even creating something positive in your mind, using the mind that we've been observing. So choose the resource that feels best for you. And we're just going to spend a moment focusing on resource to close out our practice. Okay, and as you're ready, if your eyes are closed, go ahead and blink them open. And maybe take a look around your space, just orienting to the space that you're in, looking behind you, above you, below you, taking in the space and maybe bringing a little movement to the hands, the fingers, maybe some gentle movement of the neck, the head, movement of the shoulders, and perhaps a nice deep breath, breathing in. Okay, thank you so much for practicing with me. So this was part one of a 3-part series for becoming mindful of the mind, working with the focus on mind technique. Next time, we will explore the flow, the movement and change of mental talk and mental image. So another way to observe and witness the mind. Hope you'll join me for that.